Welcome everybody, I'm Santiago Kneeland and this is The Divine Within, the invisible connection with God. Before a child encounters theology or philosophy, they encounter stories, heroes, journeys, sacrifices, and triumphs that quietly shape their understanding of courage, goodness, and truth. Myth has always been humanity's first spiritual language. Together with my guest Margie, we'll explore how these stories we tell children, from ancient myths to modern epics like Star Wars and Tolkien, help awaken their inner seeker and prepare their heart for the deeper spiritual realities of the universe. So welcome, Margie. It's an interesting topic. We've always enjoyed our conversations about myth and Star Wars, but this one I think is very, very important.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you for having me on, Santiago. But like you, I think this is, this is very, very important, particularly for young people that are having young children now or anticipating having children in the future. Being concerned about their development and their.
Yeah.
This is a good conversation to have.
Awesome, awesome. So yeah, and there's a lot of topics to cover, but we'll start from the beginning. So here in this first segment, which is the first library of the soul, we'll explore what the bases are. And before a child ever reads scripture, they meet a hero. Stories are the first library of the soul, where children learn to recognize courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and mercy. Across cultures and generations, myth has always served as a training ground for the human spirit. In this segment, we'll explore why these stories children love, from ancient mythology to modern sagas, quietly plant the seeds of spiritual identity and moral imagination. So tell us, Margie, in your experience and in what you've seen, and especially in your great attraction and appeal towards mythology, what can you tell us about this foundations that we have with children and what we tell them?
Well, it goes back. I can even remember how enthralled I was by stories of my parents or my grandparents when they would talk about the olden days. That was sort of the thing. And so, a child gets sort of into that, which is sort of the family mythology, which is great. I mean, it's wonderful because it builds those relationships with your grandparents and your aunts and uncles and cousins and everything. But then you began to look outside of that situation, and you're looking at begin to as you grow a little bit more, you look at the broader world. Of course, you're reading and you're involved in school but you begin to want to understand more. But you're also at that age, when you're playing, you may
Yeah,
be playing cowboys and Indians or whatever, and there's but it's this thing about good versus bad or good
yeah,
versus evil, that sort of thing. And so you begin to look at stories about that where there's always like a hero, and then there's the really bad guy,
yeah, yeah,
and now when I was growing up, there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, there was Superman and there were, the comics and stuff like that. And the boys had books like Tom Swift and Tom Swift Jr. My dad read Tom Swift and I read Tom Swift Jr.,
okay,
which were like a science-based sort of thing. But the lead male characters in those were strong but very, very caring male roles. Okay. The interesting part about it is that there were hardly any females in those.
yeah, yeah.
And so,
and we're going to
yeah,
talk about that later. But yeah, it's interesting how in that time it was basically just male heroes,
yeah,
right?
it was just totally, it was totally male, kind of male dominated. There were a few women, there was like the Nancy Drew books and the Trixie Bell. There were a few series like that were like teenage girls. But even in those books, they didn't have mothers to mount. Their mothers were very superficial
Yeah, yeah,
characters. And, it was really kind of, interesting. But if you were more interested in looking for like strong women, you had to go to like real hardcore mythology and start looking. And so
Yeah.
I can remember at 9, I started reading Bullfinch's mythology
Okay.
because I wanted to know about Diana of the Hunt, and Olympia and all these other that were,
Which are
I mean,
now superheroes, which
yeah,
Diana
right.
is Wonder Woman,
Wonder
right?
Woman, right, right, but she was really a goddess under the in old mythology. I mean,
In the
that's the
origin,
reason
yeah.
yeah, that's the reason they named her Diana
Yeah,
in Wonder
exactly.
Woman, and so, anyway, it was just so when I look back at my life and I look at the progression of how I was, I was looking for a heroine, that was on a journey and had a purpose and was doing things, whether it was the supernatural world or the natural world. Um, and so it was really, it was an interesting time to grow up. But I'm 76 years old, so I was growing up in the 1950s when
Yeah.
things were just becoming. I don't ever remember not having a television, I will tell you that, but, it was not, anywhere near as even though we're not quite equitable now, it's the it was very, masculine. Everything that
Yeah.
that showed
Yeah.
any strength or anything was very masculine, but they were good role models, okay? They
Okay.
they did they did do good,
Okay.
and, the biggest thing about a lot of them was that they weren't they had very little depth. In other words, they were good all the time, 100%. They couldn't make a
Yeah.
mistake, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's sort of kind of the wrong message, I think, as a kid, when you're looking out, is that you can't make a mistake and be redeemed and go on, learn from your mistake and do better, which now it's gotten a little bit more realistic in that, there's a lot of the heroes do make they make bad
They
mistakes.
go through a process, the
Right,
classical hero's journey, and that's part of the story, and that how we can relate, and we see the
right.
same things in our life. How we go through that story. But yeah, totally, and you understand the reasons behind it. But yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack here. But I mean, continue, and we'll talk about it in a minute.
Well, no, I just remember, now characters are really have a lot of depth and very much three where before they were very almost one dimensional in that this thing about it wasn't the real hero's journey like you would find
Yeah.
in old mythology, where some of the gods did really bad, in mythology they did bad things, but some of them, ultimately did choose or maybe choose or by mistake did something good. But but then we went through this period where it was very kind of one dimensional. But now, we see our characters as they do make decisions that may not be the best for all concerned, but they learn from those.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have to experience a period of redemption, and then they go on and continue their journey through life. So
They learn those lessons, and that's important. And I think, especially, I mean, that you can understand everything behind it, and that's something that I like. The way that George Lucas presented, and this is a side note, Star Wars is at the beginning. He first introduces Darth Vader as this evil guy, but then you see the before of why he turned to evil, and then you see that redemption. So it's an interesting situation because for 20 plus years, we really had this idea of Darth Vader, and suddenly we see the human part of him and why. Everybody probably thought, it was just mere power, but it was really trying to save his love. His love is his life. So you kind of understand and see where a mistake can be made. You're not perfect, and these situations where he wants to save her put you in that place, right?
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, and you see this, somewhat again and again. I mean, Tolkien used it a lot in Lord of the Rings. The Aragorn, he had basically rejected who he was,
Yeah.
and was just out kind of wandering the earth. He knew he wanted to do good. It was like, but he didn't want to pick up the mantle,
Yeah.
of doing it. He resisted that for a long time. And um Elrond and Gandalf and they all called him out on it on more than one occasion. And but then in the end, when the ring finally came forward and he knew that was his,
Yeah.
he had to pick up the mantle, and or in this case the sword, that it was remade, and go forward. Okay, but it was
It
but
wasn't
he,
easy.
yeah, it
No.
wasn't easy, but he also wasn't that sterling of a character from the very, I mean, he was a wanderer, he went out
Yeah.
wandering all over, but he wasn't really, he was gathering intelligence or something like that, but he was not wanting to be the leader he was
Yeah. He
supposed to
didn't
be.
want to assume the responsibility, that was
Right, right.
putting, yeah, and that's part of the journey as well, rejection at first, but then there's something that really, that you can't get out of it. So, we see that. So now, in this case that we're talking about the foundations, with childhood, how good is this? Because one of the things that I believe, especially, in many cases, stories, and you can tell stories, and I know that you have a wonderful project that you're going to tell us about, Uncle Joshua's workshop, and you're going to tell us what the basis, or why you created that. But in my opinion, it's really hard, especially something so abstract and so beyond our comprehension, like God and divinity and relations, within the universe. It's really difficult to explain a child, toddler, teenager. Well, maybe a teenager you can start, more of those concepts. So I believe that it's really fundamental that they grow up, especially like we were saying in the prior conversation. When they're tweens, that they have this foundations, this formation, these stories, these heroes, that they see their struggles, that they can relate with these struggles, and that they find basically their ideals. Why do I fight for this? Why do I do this? Why do I struggle? They find their values, because it's very important. It's something that it's imposed. Oh, you can't do this or you can't do that. You have to do this or you have to do that. But it's really them realizing and saying, I'm sacrificing this because of the better good, or am I doing this because I'm going to be better? So I see that, in these stories, and who doesn't want to become a hero, and a hero is really somebody, with my son, he always takes his lightsaber, and he's defeating everybody, so you're always defeating, like you said, evil. So you see this, it's basically something that's ingrained in us, because that's what we're doing in life. We're taking decisions, and when you're mature and when you're older, between doing good and doing evil in many cases. So I believe that these are foundations that, if they're not there, the kids are going to be without these values, these very, they have to be ingrained. So later in stages in life, when they start seeking, when they start, going out, they have these values, and that's what really guides them. That's what points them in the trajectory to really learn about things, and become, spiritually more adept. So I know that was a lot of stuff. So
That was
just wanted to
perfect.
throw that and
Yeah,
get your
yeah.
opinion on that.
Right. No, I totally agree with you that, you know, children, it's not so much that we want to ingrain them or indoctrinate them in
Yeah.
anything. We want them, to come to it in their own way, and we know that they have a divine spark within them that will lead them ultimately if they are open to that. But I think, to suggest to a child, that they have a guardian angel, that they have someone that is totally interested in them, that God loves them. I can tell you a funny personal story. They taught me when I was 6 years old that God was love. I heard that
Okay.
statement, and I bought totally into that. Okay, and they never could ever shake me off of it. That's the reason I could never believe in hell, even though I
Okay.
was raised in a very conservative, religious background. There were certain things that I just could not buy
Yeah.
into because of that statement that God was love. Because if God was love, there would be no hell. Okay.
Exactly,
And,
exactly.
yeah, I mean, there was just that was just, and so it was really funny. I mean, like, I was 6 years old in or 7 years old, and I was in Sunday school, and they started talking about hell, and I just said, I don't believe in that.
I
They were
imagine
like,
the reaction.
"Whoa," and they would say, "But," and I would go, "No, that's no, no, God is love." I would just say, "God is love," and no,
Yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah.
so it got to be kinda funny. I mean, they would just, like, then later, when we got older, like 11, 12 years old, we'd be in Sunday school. I grew up with all these people, and somebody would say something about hell, and somebody would go, "But Margie didn't believe in that." You know?
Yeah, well,
And
but you see,
you
well,
know?
that's the case. I mean, but I mean, how strong was that about that the image that you had about God's quality of love that
Right,
didn't dogma or any beliefs that didn't really match. They didn't make sense, and you basically passed through all that. So it's interesting
right.
how that what we're saying, how that
Yeah,
grounds
but
you.
yeah, but that's, it's just something that within me, of course, now I say that that was, the God that was within me was saying,
Yeah,
this is the course you need to stay on, okay? And it was, we used to sing the song, Jesus loves all the little children of the world. Well, then there was no way that that there was any part of that. So, um anyway, it was kind of humorous for the 7-year-old would stand up in the middle of Sunday school and say, "Well, no, you're wrong." But, but something within me told me to do that. But, and my parents had not said that to me or whatever. I don't know, I just bought into that. Well, I think there are times in children's lives when they hear or experience something or whatever, it really, sort of maybe sets in their mind, and that's
yeah,
what heroes do or heroines do is that they go, I want to be like that person.
yeah.
I want to be,
The role models fit for
yeah,
basically.
I want
Yeah,
to be I want to be the good here. I don't want to be the bad, or I don't want to be the evil. And so this is, these are pivotal moments, but they're personal in our own
yeah,
lives. And when you get older, of course, you can look back and you can see them, in your life. But when you're going through them, you don't necessarily,
yeah.
uh,
You don't
you know,
realize it.
yeah, you don't necessarily recognize them.
Yeah,
But they are very, very formative to your life. But it's not I think as a parent, you can, I mean, you've got 3 children, and I think it's very important that you model good behavior for them, and you
yeah.
point out when you see good behavior and when you see not good behavior. I think it's a different thing
Or
to
when
say.
you misbehave as well, and that's something that you constantly have to battle. I mean, the stress of life. Ever you come home and suddenly, you this and that, and suddenly you may lash out, or maybe you're not. I don't want to say lash out, but you're not that loving as you are.
Right,
So
you're not
you
as
have to
kind and loving,
recognize, yeah,
and
and yeah, and I always remember and say, sometimes especially my smallest daughter, and he says, "Can you brush my teeth?" It's like, oh, come on, and I remember, I stop myself and say, there's going to be a time when she's not going to ask you to do that, so you better take advantage of all these moments, and that really changes my mindset, and I go and do that. So it's really
right,
important,
yeah,
how you show them, and sometimes that I get angry, or maybe I cursed or did something, I misbehaved, and it's always and especially when it's against them, I go back and I apologize and I tell them, it's always important to realize, and we always commit errors, but it's more that you realize them. So it's important that
right,
because in the end,
yeah,
that's
and
we teach them.
right, and you take responsibility for it, and you say that, yeah, you truly ask for forgiveness and say you're sorry,
Yeah,
and that's and you try to take a better path. Okay, well, that teaches the children around you, or the even the more adult people around you that, I mean, a lot of people think that to admit that you're wrong shows, tremendous vulnerability and all that. It doesn't. It shows huge strength,
exactly.
and that's what you're teaching a child is that to admit you're wrong and then seek forgiveness and be truly sorry or repentant. When you get to the big things that go on in your life, you'll have had all those little experiences along the
Yeah.
way that have been building for you. Okay. It may be from the time that like I was 6 years old until, I was in college and people were really into very conservative religious stuff, and I was still like going, Nope." It was, but you knew how from all of those experiences, you knew how to be faithful to your belief,
Yeah.
not be cruel and not be a know-it-all and not be, but
Yeah.
and put it in terms of yourself. Okay. But this is what I believe.
Yeah. You're steadfast in your belief.
Yeah, you're steadfast in your belief and what you believe, but you also have to allow other people to believe what they choose to believe too. But that's what's so interesting when you start looking at heroes,
Yeah.
in books or movies or whatever, okay? That, they allow or accept people or characters or whatever as they are. I mean,
Yeah.
you can look at all of them, and there's always somebody that kind of is a little different, a little
Yeah.
strange, or does stuff, and everybody just sort of knows that that's who they
Yeah.
are.
He's accepted as they are, as it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as they are, so these are all the lessons that we grow up with, the thing is that we need to identify them as, the things that we want to model and the things that we don't want to
Yeah. Exactly.
model.
It's as
Yeah,
simple as that. It's one or the other. Awesome.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Margie, for all this information. Now we're going to be moving to our second segment, which is what happens afterwards. What happens after children get the spaces? What comes next? On the Divine Within podcast, we'll share real conversations to help you find a personal connection with God. My goal is to support your faith, growth, and journey toward discovering the divine within yourself. Join us to deepen your faith and spiritual journey.